Last month, I found myself at a quiet lounge in D.C. sharing a drink with a veteran aerospace consultant. He'd spent 30 years navigating the halls of NASA and the boardrooms of major defense contractors. And he was in high spirits. He was showing me his portfolio on his phone, pointing at this recent spike in a major aerospace stock. He was talking about lean management, asset-light strategies, and maximizing shareholder value with this kind of polished, rhythmic enthusiasm that you only hear from people who spend way too much time in PowerPoint presentations. To him, the industry had never been more efficient. But when I shifted the conversation toward the more recent technical setbacks, the endless delays of the Starliner, the cost overruns that seem to have no ceiling, his expression didn't really darken. Instead, he just gave this dismissive little wave of his hand, as if engineering failures were just minor line items that could be messaged away by the PR department. He seemed a lot more concerned with the upcoming election and how it might shift the next 2 years of budget allocations than the fact that his company was, losing the ability to actually launch humans into orbit reliably. The turning point, though, came when I showed him this short, grainy clip on my tablet. It was the simultaneous rapid-fire deployment of China's 1,000 sails constellation. And for a moment, his whole professional mask just slipped. He didn't look impressed. He looked irritated. "It's just brute force," he muttered, and his tone got really sharp and defensive. "They don't have our creative freedom. They're just following a script written 10 years ago. He then pivoted into this heated rant about how their system was rigid and robotic, even as those very robots were achieving milestones his own firm hadn't touched in a decade. That instant transition, from the smug celebration of a rising stock price to a bitter, almost visceral denial of physical reality, it left me really unsettled. It felt like watching a man brag about the paint job on a ship while the engines were being stripped for parts. And it made me realize that this new star race isn't just about who has the better fuel mixture or the faster computer. It's a trial of something much, much deeper. It's whether a civilization obsessed with the next 4 years of votes and the next 3 months of dividends can still compete with a system that measures its progress in decades and views a rocket not as a financial instrument, but as the ultimate manifestation of a nation's will. And that anecdote, I think, it really lays out the core tension we need to explore today. The new star race, it's fundamentally a competition between institutional models. Can a system that's optimized for, financial efficiency and short-term political cycles possibly keep pace with a rival civilization that views these massive technological endeavors as a national mandate, something measured in generations?
It's a perfect illustration.
Yeah, we're talking about two wildly different time horizons and value systems just crashing into each other at the orbital plane.
Exactly, because what that consultant was worried about wasn't rocket engineering. He was worried about the budget cycle, the regulatory environment, and the quarterly return.
Right.
So to truly understand why we see such vastly different outcomes in aerospace performance, why one system focuses so intensely on maximizing shareholder value while the other one focuses solely on delivering the hardware, we have to look beneath the surface, beneath the technology itself.
So that's our mission for this deep dive.
That's it. A deep dive into the underlying political and economic structures driving everything, comparing the Western liberal democratic framework with the long-term strategic command systems you see in the East. This is really, at its core, state capacity versus financialization.
Okay, let's unpack this. I think we need to start with the internal structure of the West, specifically through the lens of political science. We have to define this idea of institutional decay because it feels like the slow, quiet rot that makes all that political maneuvering seem easier than the hard work of engineering.
That's a great place to start. We can use a framework that lays out the necessary prerequisites for a truly modern functional state. A lot of this work was synthesized by political scientists like Francis Fukuyama.
Okay.
He identifies 3 crucial pillars. First, there is the state itself. And by that, he means the executive capability to actually exercise power, to collect taxes efficiently, and administer complex policies with competence.
The ability to just do things.
The ability to do things, exactly. Second, you need the rule of law, which binds the state, making sure everyone, even the government, operates within defined limits.
And a third?
Democratic accountability. That's what checks the power of the state through the people and their elected representatives. The ideal healthy system requires a really precise, delicate balance among these 3 forces. If the state is too strong and the rule of law is weak, you get authoritarianism. If the rule of law is too powerful and the state is weak, you get paralysis.
And the history of the United States shows just how challenging that balance is, because we didn't develop these three components at the same time, did we? We didn't build a strong modern state first.
That is the key American anomaly. Fukuyama notes that the United States is pretty unique because democracy and strong legal rights entrenched themselves very early on, particularly in the 19th century. And this happened before a robust, merit-based state capacity was fully built.
So what was the result of that?
Well, the result was a long period characterized by widespread political patrimony and, frankly, outright corruption. Political offices, everything from customs agents to postmasters, were openly allocated by political patronage. You got the job because you knew the senator, not because you were qualified.
So that system meant the state was effectively held hostage by the political machine. It wasn't until acts like the 1883 Pendleton Act that we introduced merit-based employment. That's when we started building a truly professional civil service.
Exactly. It took the progressive movement and then the New Deal era, decades later, to really transform the American state. That's when we built effective agencies staffed by merit-based experts. That was really the height of state competence in the 20th century.
But the argument is that the competence is now eroding.
That's the core of the critique, yes.
So if the competence is eroding, what does modern political decay actually look like? It's not about the government shutting down, right? It's about it becoming structurally inefficient.
Precisely. Modern political decay happens when those established institutional structures, they fail to adapt to societal changes or new technological challenges.
Why do they fail to adapt?
Well, the failure is often driven by the self-interest of entrenched insiders or cognitive inertia or just simple conformism. I mean, people continue doing what is comfortable even if it's no longer effective. The result is a state that's weaker, slower, and far less efficient at delivering hard results, despite often being larger and spending more money.
And here's where it connects directly back to that consultant, the one obsessed with stock prices. The system itself seems to reward behavior that accelerates this decay.
It does.
So if the machinery of government is rotting, how does that translate into the day-to-day operations of a massive defense contractor?
In the U.S., this decay manifests as an institutional preference for legal and legislative mechanisms over competent, results-driven administrative government. The process becomes the product.
The process becomes the product.
Political scientists refer to this as a system of courts and parties. This emphasis on political maneuvering results in the administrative paralysis that's known as the vitocracy.
Vitocracy, that's a term that really demands a thorough explanation. We hear all the time that checks and balances are good, so when do they become a vitocracy?
And checks and balances are essential to prevent tyranny, absolutely. But vitocracy describes a system where those very mechanisms, the ones designed to slow down abuse of power, become so numerous and so powerful that they allow even a small, determined special interest group to effectively veto measures that would be beneficial to the public good.
So it's gridlock by design, almost.
It's weaponized gridlock. Think about the practical implications in aerospace or infrastructure.
Yeah.
A small but very well-funded environmental group can leverage the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, to delay a critical launch site expansion or a new energy grid connection for 7 or 8 years through mandated studies and legal challenges.
And that isn't a quick check. That's systemic paralysis.
It is. These groups capture Congress through lobbying, they distort spending mandates for their own benefit, and they introduce conflicting and paralyzing objectives into the bureaucracy itself.
So if they can't win in Congress or the agencies, they turn to the courts, which you mentioned leads to this judicialization.
Absolutely. Judicialization is the preference for resolving policy and administrative disputes through lengthy, incredibly costly legal proceedings. And this process is actively and intentionally used by special interest groups that could be competitors, rival industries, or political opponents to challenge and delay government actions until the funding runs dry or the political landscape changes.
When you look at the consequences, they must be staggering. You mentioned uncertainty, procedural complexity, redundancy, lack of finality, and high transaction costs. That's the bureaucratic swamp they have to navigate.
It means that if you're a major contractor, you budget not just for the engineering, but for the inevitable litigation. The transaction costs of building anything big in the U.S. are exponentially higher than in systems that don't suffer from this level of decay.
Which perfectly explains the consultant's attitude.
It does. If the institutional default is litigation and political maneuvering, then technical failure becomes less important than successfully navigating the administrative process. Why worry about a delayed Starliner launch when the real fight is convincing Congress to fund the next contract or navigating a new regulatory hurdle? You can message away an engineering setback because the system values legal compliance and procedural mastery above actual hard competence in delivery.
It sounds like the system selects for political operators, not just brilliant engineers.
Yeah.
And that brings us to how the West measures and allocates that competence, which ties directly into a fascinating critique of our contemporary idea of meritocracy.
It really does. Let's dive into that critique, especially since we often just assume that in a market economy, the best and brightest naturally rise to the top.
We treat meritocracy as this sacred, purely objective ideal.
Right, but the critique starts by reminding us that the term meritocracy itself was originally coined satirically back in 1958 by a sociologist named Michael Young. It was intended to mock the very idea that all measures of merit are objective.
So it was a warning, not an ideal.
Exactly. Critics argue that the system, as it's currently practiced, doesn't reward objective technical skill, the ability to, say, build a working rocket engine, but rather it rewards those who are already advantaged by birth, by network, or by access to capital. Those who succeed are simply assumed to be the best after the fact.
When we look at the high-profile figures who dominate the aerospace conversation today, figures like Elon Musk, he seems to illustrate this perceived failure to allocate competence correctly.
He is a fascinating and very complex case study for this critique. On one hand, his companies, SpaceX and Tesla, have achieved revolutionary, tangible engineering successes. Reliable, reusable rockets, the mass adoption of electric vehicles. This proves competence exists within those organizations.
Absolutely, the results speak for themselves.
But many critics argue that the revolutionary engineering success of SpaceX is achieved in spite of his direct technical involvement, and that it's really thanks to the world-class engineers he hired, organized, and motivated.
So the argument is that his true talent isn't in material science or fluid dynamics, but in something else entirely.
Exactly. The critics claim his true intelligence is not applied to rocket science, but primarily to stock market manipulation, leveraging public confidence, and securing massive government subsidies and contracts.
So the system, in that view, selects for grift, or market ability, or leveraging capital, the skill to convince the market and the state that he and his projects are smart, not necessarily deep, verifiable technical merit in the traditional engineering sense.
It rewards a market operator who can leverage financial tools even if the underlying technical product is achieved by others. That's the argument.
It's the persistent cultural appeal of the perfect guy, isn't it? The Renaissance man who could just solve everything. And ironically, that's also the core psychological appeal behind authoritarian systems, that desire for a single decisive leader to cut through all the bureaucracy and just fix it.
That belief that competence should equal power and that markets correctly identify competence is profoundly appealing, especially when the state is bogged down by vitocracy. But the way we currently measure competence in the West is, according to this critique, flawed.
How so?
Well, if you have highly qualified immigrant chemistry PhDs driving taxis in major American cities because the structural hurdles or licensing requirements are insurmountable, while less technically qualified individuals are elevated to positions of immense power because of existing capital or market savvy,
Then something is broken.
it confirms the critique. It proves that the current meritocratic ideal is fundamentally broken in its execution, and the state's capacity to recognize and utilize actual technical skill is impaired.
And this flawed allocation of power, this ties directly into the chaos we see spreading across Western societies. It creates this cyclical decline.
It does, through systemic economic pressures. One powerful theory, based on the study of what's called cryodynamics, points to elite overproduction.
Elite overproduction.
We now have far more highly educated people, university graduates, PhDs, MBAs, all competing for a very limited number of truly elite positions.
So the pyramid is getting wider at the top, but the apex is still just as sharp.
Precisely. And this intense competition for scarce status and power, it incentivizes corruption. And crucially, it forces the existing elites to extract larger and larger portions of the wealth being generated just to maintain their status and defend their positions from the next generation.
Which would explain the skyrocketing of CEO pay compared to real wages.
It's cited as the primary mechanism. It's an internal status arms race designed to solidify your position at the top.
So the state is becoming less capable, and the rewards for those at the top are increasingly divorced from any demonstrable technical or public benefit. No wonder the consultant was focused on his stock price and not his delayed rocket.
He was operating perfectly within the logic of the system. And if the system is designed to reward extraction and financial manipulation, how can we possibly expect the defense industrial base to be any different?
It can't be.
It can't. The logic of financialization combined with political decay shapes absolutely everything.
And that leads us directly into the economic models driving aerospace performance, which are, as we've said, fundamentally different depending on whether we look east or west. Let's shift now to the structure of the defense market itself. This concept of the defense industrial base, or DIB, historically, governments maintain these DIBs as special protected sectors by paying what's called a sovereignty price. What did that financial bargain actually entail?
A sovereignty price is essentially a national insurance premium. It meant that governments were willing to pay more often, significantly more than a global market price, to maintain key, sometimes even autarkic, defense capabilities entirely within their own borders.
So it was a protected market.
Completely insulated. The government was the monopsonistic consumer, meaning they were the only major buyer. This ensured domestic producers had stable business, regardless of global cost efficiency. The goal was reliability and independence, not quarterly profit optimization.
But the end of the Cold War changed that fundamental calculus for everyone, right? That massive government demand just shrank dramatically.
It changed everything. Globalization eventually hit the A&D sector just later than other industries. Defense budgets declined sharply across NATO, just as technological complexity, and the per-unit costs for platforms like advanced fighter jets or precision missiles were skyrocketing.
That must have created immense pressure on those traditional national DIB models.
It did. Smaller states faced the starkest choices. Either you exit the sector entirely, you transition to only making components for other countries' systems, or you try to survive by emphasizing exports and international collaboration to keep your firms financially viable despite weak domestic demand.
This shift really set the stage for two diverging structural paths in the West, which political economists classify as liberal market economies, or LMEs, and coordinated market economies, CMEs. Let's start with the archetypal LMEs, the US and the UK. What defines their model?
Well, LMEs are defined by a hands-off, laissez-faire approach from the government. The relationship with industry is strictly rules-based, contractual, and kept at arm's length. There's no informal management, no long-term industrial policy.
And the U.S. is unique even within that model.
It is because of its sheer scale. It's one of the only nations that can finance competing corporate structures, allowing for programs like the F-35, where you can have dual competition between major primes like Lockheed Martin and Boeing.
But this liberal market approach in the U.S. has led to an intense degree of what you call financialization within its major defense contractors. When you say financialization, you mean firms prioritizing shareholder returns over their own industrial capacity.
It's a deep-seated structural problem. Firms like Lockheed Martin and Boeing exhibit a clear priority that dominates all their long-term planning, returning capital to investors over long-term capital investments or even debt reduction.
Can you give us an example of that?
Sure. Look at the numbers. Lockheed Martin, in one recent year, repurchased $2.1 billion in stock and paid out $2 billion in dividends. Wow.
That is $4.1 billion flowing directly to investors, money that could have been used to modernize production lines, invest in speculative R&D that might not pay off for a decade, or reduce their debt load.
And that pressure isn't coming from inside the engineering departments.
Not at all. It's mandated by the investment management groups who hold the majority of the stock and are focused intently on near-term profit and maximizing the share price. That is the financialization feedback loop. Extracting value for investors becomes the primary measure of corporate health, sometimes at the expense of core industrial capacity.
It creates a perverse incentive. Why would you spend $1 billion on a new, risky manufacturing facility that might take 10 years to pay off when you can spend that billion on stock buybacks and see an immediate jump in your earnings per share, satisfying the quarterly report? Exactly. The pressure of the quarterly reporting cycle, the very thing the consultant was celebrating, is fundamentally incompatible with the 20-year time horizon required to develop an advanced fighter jet or a new launch architecture. You have to constantly justify everything based on immediate financial return.
And the UK followed a similar, maybe even more extreme market-driven path when they reformed their DIB.
They did. The UK embraced extreme market rigor under Margaret Thatcher. This involved large-scale privatizations and an astonishing openness to foreign ownership, even allowing firms controlled by foreign states to purchase core British defense firms. They became one of the most open defense markets in Europe.
They wanted to eliminate that sovereignty price entirely.
Completely. They wanted to run defense like any other business. And yet, even in this staunch LME, the political reality is that national security concerns never entirely vanish. The persistent national desire to maintain core indigenous capabilities led the government to fortify BAE Systems as a national champion.
How did they do that?
They often used golden shares to control strategic decisions, ensuring the firm couldn't be entirely taken over or stripped of its most critical capabilities. So even in the most market-oriented systems, there is still this underlying tension between financial efficiency and national strategic interest.
So the LME model prioritizes market efficiency and investor returns. But what are the long-term structural consequences of forcing defense production into this purely financialized, short-term market structure?
The consequences are severe, particularly for high-end systems. The market structure for advanced fighter aircraft, for example, is trending toward long-term failure. The capital required to develop a cutting-edge platform has just soared. Production runs are low volume because the costs are so high, and nationalist acquisition biases create prohibitively high barriers for any new entrant.
So only a few players worldwide can even attempt it.
A tiny number. And this forces the U.S. to rely on those massive, high-cost franchise programs like the F-35.
These are what you call winner-take-all procurements.
Exactly. Because the R&D cost is so enormous, the government can only afford one or two major programs. This creates this hyper-intense competition focused only on developing exquisite, meaning incredibly complex and technologically advanced high-end systems.
But isn't exquisite necessary for modern warfare?
Yeah.
I mean, we need the best technology, right?
We do, but the focus on only exquisite systems, coupled with the difficulty of securing long-term, stable funding, leads to a critical weakness. A catastrophic lack of industrial surge capacity.
Surge capacity.
When you only build the most complex, bespoke, expensive machine imaginable, your supply chain becomes fragile, highly specialized, and deeply reliant on foreign suppliers for critical components.
Give me a practical example.
Think about it this way. If a protracted conflict required the U.S. to rapidly increase F-35 production from, say, 100 units a year to 300 units a year within 18 months, we simply couldn't.
The capacity isn't there.
The highly complex manufacturing lines and the specialized, non-redundant supply chains, they don't allow for quick scaling. The capacity simply isn't there because the market demanded efficiency over redundancy. This lack of a balanced high-low mix, a combination of expensive, exquisite systems and cheap, mass-producible systems, is a direct result of financialization pushing for low-volume, high-margin products.
And you mentioned that the firm's portfolio management becomes reactive to these short-term government requirements.
Constantly. The constant flux in government procurement forces firms to continually restructure their entire business portfolio just to mitigate risk and chase the next big government decision. We see this with Lockheed Martin. They acquired Sikorsky, the helicopter manufacturer, explicitly to reduce their dependence on the F-35 and increase their foreign market exposure.
At the same time, they were divesting other parts.
Right. They divested their IS&GS division because those technical services contracts were no longer adding enough corporate value or high margins. Portfolio management, which is guided by the financial markets, becomes directly linked to short-term government requirements, not necessarily long-term strategic needs. And that makes the entire industrial base brittle.
So the LME model generates amazing quarterly profits, and it selects for market savvy, but it sacrifices industrial resilience and long-term strategic capacity.
Let's look at the alternatives, because they seem to take the complete opposite approach. That brings us neatly to the alternative models, the coordinated market economies and the command systems of the East. These have a radically different, much closer relationship between the state and industry.
That's right. If LMEs are defined by arm's-length contracts, coordinated market economies, or CMEs like France and Italy are characterized by tight government management, retention of significant state ownership, and informal coordination dynamics that are often invisible to the public market.
France is the quintessential CME here, isn't it? The state and the defense firms are almost indistinguishable. That's absolutely right. In France, the defense industrial base is highly concentrated. And the government and major defense firms like Dassault and Thales, they function almost as one enterprise.
How do they achieve that?
They achieve it through personnel flow. Professionals routinely cycle between the government directorate, the DGA, and the leadership of these major firms. They share a similar educational background, often coming from the same grande école, which creates this tight-knit community with a shared strategic vision.
That close integration must allow for incredibly seamless execution of strategy. It must cut through a lot of that procedural vitocracy we discussed earlier.
It does. It allows for a single long-term strategic perspective. And the primary French strategy is autonomy. They want to maintain the ability to design and build their own major platforms without foreign dependency.
Which is incredibly expensive.
It is. So to finance this expensive autonomy, they rely heavily on exports. They aggressively bet on the scale of the European Union, but critically, they push their platforms globally. In 2016, for instance, Dassault earned a staggering 92% of its revenue from exports.
92%.
Which just shows how necessary foreign markets are to finance the long-term strategic vision of the French state.
What's the downside of that level of coordination, though?
Resistance to change. When the community is that tight-knit, it can become intellectually rigid. New ideas that threaten the existing structure or the established ways of thinking are resisted intensely because they threaten the consensus of the elite.
Now let's look at Italy, another CME, which maintains direct control through state ownership. That seems like a much clearer expression of state capacity.
It is. The Italian government retains considerable direct authority. They hold 30% of Leonardo, their major defense conglomerate, and 72% of Fincantieri, the shipbuilding giant.
And it's not just ownership.
No, beyond ownership, the government possesses legal powers, including the right to veto acquisitions that conflict with national security interests. State ownership in this model is specifically intended to provide continuity and strategic perspective.
A longer view.
A much longer view toward financing large, risky investments than the LME system allows. If the state is the owner, it doesn't need to justify every expense to a quarterly investment cycle. However, this system also has its flaws. It often leads to the appointment of non-defense executives, sometimes banking executives, to run defense firms, which injects a financial focus without the necessary technical expertise.
Interesting.
And the resulting corporate structure can remain decentralized and less integrated internally, particularly in a consolidated firm like Leonardo, which has struggled to become one company capable of delivering massive unified projects.
Okay, now when we look further east, the system shifts entirely away from market logic toward pure state command. This is where the consultant's visceral fear of brute force comes from. But we need to understand the strategic logic behind it.
Absolutely. Systems like Russia and China, they operate in a different paradigm. It's one that is steeped in the lingering impulses of command economics. The state elites actively manipulate their defense industrial bases, not for market efficiency, but to serve two primary intertwined goals.
What are those goals?
First, they act as incubators for the national innovation system, driving technological progress across the entire economy. And second, they ensure the guaranteed delivery of arms for the pursuit of national power projection.
So they underwrite the entire aerospace activity, and they just accept the distortion of efficient capital allocation as a necessary cost of maintaining state control and achieving those long-term goals.
That is the core difference. The central dilemma for these regimes is balancing disruptive, value-generating market activity, the kind that creates true innovation, with the state's paramount need to control economic activity for regime preservation. They resolve this by choosing centralized control, often distorting efficient capital allocation because the cost of losing control is perceived as higher than the cost of economic inefficiency.
And their developmental path was different.
Critically different. As Fukuyama noted, China acquired a strong, centralized state early on before fully developing the rule of law or democratic accountability. He argues this sequence strong state first is developmentally right for rapid national industrialization.
It lets them do things the West can't.
It allows for massive, sustained, long-term national projects like building a 1,000-sail satellite constellation without the paralyzing political decay or the vitocracy that burdens the West. What the Western consultants saw as brute force is simply the application of pure, unconstrained state capacity.
That makes the Western reaction seem almost naive, failing to recognize that the lack of internal dissent or regulatory delay is actually a strategic advantage. But even for the market-oriented West, there are moments where national will completely overrides financial logic.
Sweden provides a fascinating case study here. It sits somewhere between the LME and CME models. Sweden is heavily liberalized, and it promotes exports to sustain its small DIB, but the government maintains an acute, almost existential understanding of its industrial health.
You have an example of this.
A great one. We saw this when the Swedish government intervened forcefully when the submarine manufacturer Kockums was sold to a foreign purchaser. The government didn't use contracts or file a lawsuit. They physically deployed armed officials to retrieve submarine blueprints from the foreign purchaser to secure that core indigenous capability.
That's a direct, unapologetic assertion of state capacity.
An assertion of national will overriding a commercial transaction. But political will cuts both ways, financially speaking. A strategic decision that prioritizes national capacity might conflict with the financial viability of the firm itself.
Right.
More recently, political changes in Sweden, specifically the Green and Social Democratic Coalition, implemented rigorous ethical export standards. This was a clear expression of cultural and political will, overriding pure market interests. This forced Saab, a national champion whose export market is vital for its survival, to exit highly lucrative markets like Saudi Arabia.
So the government's levers are driven by political and cultural will,
which may directly conflict with the financial viability of the DIB. It demonstrates that long-term political and cultural ideology can, even in a market economy, trump short-term profit, though often with painful financial consequences for the firms involved.
The lesson seems to be that regardless of the economic model, the power of the state's will, when it's applied consistently, is the ultimate determinant of the technological trajectory. So this all boils down to what we started with, this efficiency paradox. The West is outstandingly efficient at generating quarterly profits, but structurally terrible at long-term, expensive state-building projects like advanced aerospace.
That's the core insight we must reiterate. Western systems, driven by LME principles and intense financialization, are highly efficient at maximizing shareholder value. We saw Lockheed Martin stock soar almost 200% over 5 years, even while key programs like the F-35 suffer chronic cost overruns. The market rewards the financialization process.
But that short-term profit focus creates long-term structural weakness in state capacity and industrial readiness.
Absolutely. So when a Western firm needs to justify R&D, they must have a high expected return on investment, a concrete business case that fits within a short time horizon, usually 5 years or less.
And that automatically screens out the truly transformative, high-risk, decades-long fundamental research needed for space exploration or next-generation defense.
Of course. Why would you invest in an entirely new rocket architecture that might not launch for 15 years when you can perform a stock buyback this quarter? It doesn't make sense in that system.
Whereas a state-controlled or coordinated system, like those in the East,
they can view a rocket not as a financial instrument requiring justification based on projected quarterly returns, but simply as a manifestation of a nation's strategic will. Their time horizon is fundamentally different. Their focus is on the power projection and national prestige derived from the capability, not the return on investment.
That structural difference, it speaks volumes about the psychological framework in these systems. It highlights a tendency in human nature that the political philosopher Terry Pratchett captured so well. He described people mentally dividing the universe into the deserving and the undeserving, and just assuming they're on the appropriate side.
It's the perfect analogy for the consultant in your story. Having benefited hugely from a system that rewards financial efficiency and market success, he assumed that success meant his civilization was inherently superior or more creative.
Right, he just dismissed the real physical reality of the Chinese deployment as mere brute force.
Exactly. He equated complexity of process with a superior civilization, not recognizing that the complexity of his process, the vitocracy, the judicialization, was actually a weakness.
Let's connect this back to the social chaos we discussed earlier. The structural pressures of elite overproduction and financial extraction seem to be accelerating this internal decline, making the West less capable of fixing its own system, even if the strategic need is obvious.
They're acting as a destructive, dysfunctional feedback loop. When elite overproduction incentivizes the existing elite to extract massive portions of wealth, which we see in skyrocketing executive compensation, it creates intense internal instability, distrust, and eventually political dysfunction.
Because politicians and activists then prioritize ideological compatibility over policies that actually work.
Precisely. We see this often in high-attention social and economic crises, like the housing crisis in many Western cities, the structural problems, the boring details of zoning reform, tax policy, industrial organization. They're all ignored because the issue is treated primarily as a moral or ideological battleground.
When political attention and emotional fervor are high, efficacy is often low.
It is. The focus is on the ideological war and scoring political points, not the complex incremental policy execution required to actually solve the problem.
And this lack of focus means problems are never truly solved.
And when the American state performs poorly, as Fukuyama noted, it reinforces popular distrust and lessens popular investment in the state itself. It creates a vicious cycle that fuels further institutional decay and impedes necessary government reforms. The inability of liberal democracies to course-correct without mass internal friction is being severely challenged by this increasing paralysis.
And the high transaction costs and the inability to implement effective long-term policy further erode the competence that the state needs to match the long-term strategic investments being made by competing models in the East.
The inability of the Western system to deploy capital efficiently into productive industrial capacity, choosing instead to channel it into financial engineering, is the defining feature of this competition. When the core industrial engine is stripped for parts to satisfy shareholder demands, the long-term capacity for technological dominance inevitably fades.
So ultimately, the current geopolitical competition in aerospace isn't a simple battle of fuel efficiency or microchip speed.
No, it is a profound systemic trial. We are watching the collision between systems designed primarily to serve the short-term financial markets and systems designed to execute the state's strategic long-term will. The rising stock price celebrated by that aerospace consultant is merely masking the underlying erosion of the critical industrial engine required for true technological and, critically, civilizational dominance.
This shift represents a fundamental historical transition in competition. The future of aerospace and possibly global power will be decided not by which country boasts the most revolutionary billionaire entrepreneur, but by which governance model is capable of sustaining a 50-year engineering vision. The institutional structure is the ultimate weapon in the star race.